The courtroom was still settling when she walked in. No one turned, no one whispered, no eyes followed her. And maybe that was exactly the point. Evelyn Mercer stepped into the 12th District Civil Court like a quiet question mark at the end of a very loud sentence. Gray sweater, scuffed leather flats. Hair twisted into a plain knot at the nape of her neck. She carried a battered tote that looked more suited for library books than legal briefs. If someone had asked the bailiff who she was, he might have said a clerk maybe, or someone from the outreach office. But that was the plan. Judge Leonard Ramsey sat high on his bench, his fingers idly flipping through a stack of pre-filed motions. The gallery was already beginning to fill. Legal interns, a pair of local reporters, 3 paralegals in matching pencil skirts, and the corporate team from Fairpoint Realty, gleaming tailored confident. They didn't notice Evelyn slip into the front row. Not yet. In a city where confidence dressed in tailored blazers and carried $800 briefcases, Evelyn's quiet presence was almost aggressive in its simplicity. She didn't want to stand out. She wanted to disappear just long enough. From her seat, she watched the light shift across the courtroom's tall windows, casting pale gold streaks on the marble floor. The air smelled faintly of dust and pine-scented cleaner. She glanced at the digital clock above the judge's bench. 9 minutes AU. The residents would be arriving soon. She had promised them she'd be there early, that she'd already be inside, steady and ready. Across the aisle, the defense team filtered in like a wave of certainty. Alan Brewster, lead counsel for Fairpoint, leaned over to whisper something to one of his associates. They chuckled, looked briefly toward Evelyn, then turned away without acknowledgement. She didn't flinch. She didn't need to be seen. Not yet. 3 hours. Earlier. The alarm had gone off at exactly 6:00 a.m., slicing through the stillness of Evelyn's one-bedroom apartment like a summons. She didn't need it. She'd been awake for nearly an hour, already lying silently with her eyes open, thinking about every possible version of how the morning might unfold. She sat up slowly, letting the cold floor greet her bare feet. Her hands moved methodically, boiling water for tea, reviewing the printed briefs, one last time, laying out the clothes she'd chosen 2 days ago. Not the navy blazer, not the soft silk blouse, not today. Today required something else. She chose the old gray sweater, the one with sleeves slightly stretched at the cuffs. The black slacks fit well enough, but looked plain. She reached for the wireframe glasses tucked away in her desk drawer, ones she hadn't worn since law school. They felt awkward on her face, heavier somehow. She pulled her hair into a no-nonsense bun. No lipstick, no earrings. She stared at herself in the mirror. Unremarkable, unthreatening, almost invisible. This has to work, she whispered to the woman in the reflection. She reached for her phone. A new message flashed across the screen. Walter Fields. We're all counting on you, Miss Mercer. God bless you today. She smiled faintly, then tucked the phone into her coat pocket. Walter had once led a platoon into enemy fire in Korea. Now at 82, he was fighting a different kind of war, one waged with paperwork, zoning loopholes, and lawyers who wore $5,000 watches. He and the other Maplewood residents had nowhere else to go. Fairpoint. Realty wanted their building, not for the people, but for the location. And Evelyn Mercer wasn't going to let them take it. But she couldn't walk into Judge Leonard Ramsey's courtroom looking like a threat. Not yet. Judge Ramsey's reputation. Leonard Ramsey had built a 20-year reputation as the sort of judge who didn't like drama. By drama, most attorneys knew he meant emotions, and by emotions, he usually meant women. Ramsey liked clean motions, clear evidence, and tidy conclusions, and he had a blind spot. He assumed the most confident person in the room was the most competent. That was Evelyn's opening. Because when you enter his courtroom looking like a lion, he sees you coming. But if you look like a lamb, he never sees the teeth until it's too late. 9:28 a.m. back in court. The first of the Maplewood residents arrived, moving slowly through the rear courtroom doors. Walter Fields shuffled beside Dolores Meeks, a former librarian now nearly blind from glaucoma. Behind them came Reuben Hardy. They all wore their Sunday best, not because they expected to win, but because they believed in showing up with dignity, even to a place where dignity was often forgotten. Walter caught Evelyn's eye. She smiled gently and gave him the smallest nod. "That's her," Reuben whispered, confused. "I thought she'd be—" He trailed off, not quite sure what he meant. Walter just said, "That's her." A final moment of silence. As the room settled, Evelyn Mercer closed her eyes for a single breath. She didn't rehearse her opening. that had been done already weeks ago in her kitchen at 2 a.m., in hotel rooms during previous hearings, in conference calls with activists, historians, and veterans. No, now was not the time for speeches. Now was the time for silence, to let herself become exactly what she needed to be underestimated. As Judge Ramsey's footsteps echoed from the hallway, Evelyn Mercer sat perfectly still. Not commanding, not radiating presence, just still. And then slowly the judge entered. All rise for the Honorable Leonard Ramsey. The performance had begun. The courtroom buzzed with the faint murmur of shifting coats tapping pens and the occasional cough, the ordinary background noise of justice about to begin. But for Evelyn Mercer, this wasn't noise, it was a signal. Every eye that didn't meet hers, every glance that passed through her as though she were made of mist was a reassurance. It meant the disguise was working. Judge Ramsey settled into his seat with the authority of a man who believed the weight of the institution rested squarely on his shoulders. His reputation was carved from precedent tempered in detachment and lacquered with an unwavering trust in bureaucracy. From the bench, he scanned the courtroom, recognizing the Fairpoint Realty attorneys immediately. Alan Brewster rose with the ease of someone used to being favored. "Good morning, Your Honor," Brewster said, with practiced charm. Mr. Brewster Ramsey acknowledged with a nod that carried a hint of familiarity. "You've brought your full cavalry today." Brewster chuckled modestly. "Just enough to keep things efficient, sir." Ramsey smirked. "Efficiency is welcome in this court." Then his eyes shifted, sweeping across to Evelyn. No nod, no greeting, just the faintest tightening at the corner of his mouth. His gaze dropped to the notes in front of him, then back to Evelyn. "And I see we have new counsel for the plaintiffs," he said, as if someone had slipped an unfamiliar name into his script. Evelyn stood her posture, demure her voice, even. "Yes, Your Honor, Evelyn Mercer, representing Maplewood residents and its tenants." Ramsey lifted an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Let's hope we don't waste the court's time today." Behind Evelyn, Walter straightened in his seat. His hand gripped the side of the pew until his knuckles paled. Dolores Meeks leaned toward him, whispering softly. "He didn't even say good morning," Walter murmured. "He will." Evelyn didn't flinch. She nodded politely and sat down. She had counted on this. Ramsey didn't just underestimate people who looked like her today, plain restrained, unremarkable. He underestimated those who refused to posture. To him, power wore polish. And Evelyn's choice not to wear hers was already shaping the story he'd tell himself about who she was. Let him believe it. The more certain he became, the more powerful the reversal would be. The defense asserts the stage. Alan Brewster approached the bench with the poise of a man already halfway to victory. His notes were organized into sleek black folders. His voice was confident, but not cocky. A tone perfected over years of speaking for billion-dollar interests without sounding like it. "Your Honor," he began, "today's matter concerns Fairpoint Realty's application for redevelopment of the Maplewood property. As we've outlined in our filings, Maplewood has long ceased to be financially viable. The property is outdated, underutilized, and represents a net loss to both its owners and the surrounding community." He gestured elegantly toward a document on his table. "Our records show all legal procedures were followed to the letter. The rezoning request was approved by the municipal board, and all tenant notifications were delivered as required by statute." Ramsey nodded, jotting something down. Brewster continued, "This is not a matter of morality or sentiment. It is a matter of legal entitlement. The owners of the property are within their rights to pursue the development, which will bring economic growth and revitalization to the area." He paused just long enough for the point to sink in. "Maplewood, Your Honor, is a relic. The time has come to evolve." Ramsey glanced up. "Thank you, Mr. Brewster, clear and concise as always." Then he looked at Evelyn, and in that pause the entire courtroom held its breath, not because they expected a great speech, but because they didn't. A calculated beginning. Evelyn rose slowly, her fingers grazing the edge of the plaintiff's table, as if for balance. She reached into her tote and withdrew a modest binder. Not the sleek kind that Fairpoint's attorneys used, but the kind with plastic sleeves that showed signs of reuse. She flipped it open, careful not to rush. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but deliberate. "Maplewood Residence is home to over 60 elderly citizens, many of them veterans' widows, and long-standing members of our city's fabric. They have active leases, they have rights." Ramsey leaned back slightly. "Ms. Mercer, this court is aware of what a lease is. If you have legal arguments to present, I suggest you begin with those." A faint chuckle slipped from one of Brewster's associates. Another scribbled something smug into a yellow legal pad. Evelyn gave no reaction. "Of course, Your Honor," she said softly. "My clients contest the validity of the zoning approval on the grounds that public notice requirements were not properly fulfilled. I have sworn statements from 12 residents confirming they were never notified, either in writing or in person, of any impending zoning hearings." She slid a small packet forward. "These are the affidavits." Ramsey didn't reach for them. "Affidavits," he said flatly, "can be written by anyone. Do you have proof? Something beyond anecdotal protest." Brewster stood immediately. "Your Honor, we submitted signed postal confirmations in our March filing indicating all notices were delivered." Ramsey nodded. "Indeed. That would seem to meet procedural standards." Evelyn didn't blink. "We've reviewed those confirmations. The dates listed do not align with the City Council's required timelines for notice delivery. In several instances, the confirmation forms appear to have been batch processed in a single day, rather than distributed individually over a notification period." She turned a page in her binder. "We are requesting a forensic review of the delivery timestamps and a comparison with city clerk records if the court allows it." Now Ramsey frowned. For the first time, his gaze lingered on her, not quite impressed, but not entirely dismissive either. Still, he gave her no ground. "This is speculative, Ms. Mercer. You're relying on holes in timing rather than holes in law." "There's more," Evelyn said, her tone unchanged. Ramsey folded his hands. "Is there? Because what I've seen so far looks like a tenant grievance, not a legal basis for intervention." The smirk returned to Brewster's face. Evelyn recognized it. It was the same expression Ramsey used on younger lawyers, the slow slide into wrap-it-up territory. And she let him have it. She hesitated, not from uncertainty, but as an actor might pause between lines. "There's also the matter of historical status." She said finally, "Maplewood may qualify for municipal preservation under the McKinney Doctrine." Ramsey's brow arched. "You're invoking McKinney." "Yes, Your Honor." McKinney was deemed inapplicable to residential buildings in E07. Only in cases lacking veteran occupancy, Evelyn responded, flipping to a tab. Section 12, Clause B, revised in 2014, extends consideration to buildings with 60% or greater population of protected classes, including seniors and veterans. "Is that so?" Ramsey murmured, a trace of genuine curiosity in his voice. "It is behind the curtain." As she returned to her seat, Evelyn could feel the tension ripple behind her. Walter leaned forward. "He doesn't like you, does he?" he whispered. "He doesn't know me," Evelyn replied. "Feels like he doesn't care to." She smiled faintly. "That's better." Walter looked puzzled. Because Evelyn said softly, when someone like him thinks they know everything, they stop looking. They stop listening. That's when you can show them something they'll never forget. Brewster was flipping rapidly through his own binder now, whispering to his co-counsel. Ramsey scratched something on a notepad, then looked up. "Ms. Mercer," he said, "is this your first major case?" Silence. Even Brewster blinked. Evelyn let the question hang in the air a moment longer than expected. "I've handled similar matters," she said finally, carefully. Ramsey gave her a long, slow stare. "I thought as much." Then he turned to his clerk, set a recess 20 minutes. The gavel didn't slam. It didn't need to. The message had been sent, but what Judge Leonard Ramsey didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Evelyn Mercer had just finished setting her stage, and everything that followed would turn on the fact that no one in that courtroom had really seen her. Not yet. The courtroom resumed with the quiet thump of footsteps and murmured conversations. Legal pads returned to laps. Pens clicked back into action, and Evelyn Mercer once again became the least noticeable person in the room. Just as she intended, Judge Ramsey entered from chambers precisely on time. His robe flowed behind him like a cloak of authority, heavy with the weight of 100 rulings. He didn't glance at Evelyn as he took his seat. He didn't have to. His silence was louder than any rebuke. "Let's proceed," he said. Voice clipped. "Mr. Brewster, continue." Alan Brewster rose, flashing a rehearsed smile. "Thank you. Your Honor, I'd like to call attention to Exhibit D copies of lease termination notices delivered to all current Maplewood tenants, along with proof of service." He motioned to his assistant, who approached the bench with a stack of bound documents. "These include signed receipts and timestamps from certified mail, all of which fall within the statutory window outlined by City Ordinance 48-6. Ramsey accepted the folders and flipped through the first few pages with an expression of mild approval. "I see," he said, very thorough. Brewster turned toward Evelyn. Should opposing counsel wish to challenge the legitimacy of these, I'm happy to clarify. He didn't say should Ms. Mercer. He didn't say the plaintiff. He said opposing counsel, the legal term, and it sounded like a joke in his mouth, polite, hollow, performative. Evelyn stood, no folder in hand this time, just her. Your Honor, she began calmly. While the receipts are indeed dated, there's reason to believe they were processed in bulk rather than delivered individually. My clients maintain that they received no such notices, and the delivery records show anomalies. Ramsey didn't look up. Affidavits, Ms. Mercer. We've already discussed this. I understand, Your Honor, Evelyn said, not shifting her tone. But additionally, the records include signatures from residents who are either legally blind or deceased. Ramsey paused mid-page. Brewster stiffened. Which pages? Ramsey asked. Page 14. Your Honor. Mr. Samuel Dean is listed as having signed his own notice. Mr. Dean passed away in February, 2 weeks prior to the date listed. Brewster was already rifling through his binder. Clerical error, he said. The notice likely went to the next of kin. No such delivery was recorded, Evelyn replied. Still calm. We checked. There was no forwarding address. And the signature on file doesn't match Mr. Dean's previous documents. In fact, Ms. Mercer. Ramsey cut in sharply. Are you implying fraud? No, Your Honor, she answered. I'm implying haste. The courtroom shifted in its seat. A few eyebrows lifted. Brewster turned to Ramsey. This is a sideshow. None of this changes the fact that the property owners followed the required procedures. You're right, Ramsey replied. It doesn't, Ms. Mercer. Unless you have something that meets the evidentiary standard, I suggest we move on. The moment they waited. For behind, Evelyn, the elderly resident, sat frozen. Walter Fields had his hands clenched so tightly on his cane that the knuckles blanched white. Dolores stared straight ahead, unblinking. And Evelyn stood still, standing, not flinching, not apologizing. I'd like to raise one more point, Your Honor, she said. Ramsey looked weary. This better be a legal argument. Ms. Mercer. It is. I'd like to discuss the historical classification of the Maplewood building under Municipal Code 62B. A groan from one of Brewster's associates. Ramsey leaned back in his chair with audible irritation. Ms. Mercer, the building is not and has never been historically designated. That's true, she replied, but it qualifies for eligibility under the Williams precedent. That name landed in the room like a dropped glass. Ramsey frowned. Williams versus Northeastern Development. Yes, Your Honor. 2008, Third Circuit. Elderly occupied properties of more than 20 years qualify for expedited review even without prior designation. Ramsey squinted. That case applied to Pennsylvania. Brewster was already speaking. Your Honor, Williams was a narrow ruling limited to a regional context. It's not relevant here. Evelyn took a single step forward. With respect, Your Honor, the Massachusetts Supreme Court cited Williams favorably just last year in Geller for Boston Housing Authority. Ramsey blinked. Evelyn didn't stop. Page 47. Your Honor, the ruling states, and I quote, the rationale underpinning. Williams extends across state lines, particularly in cases where displacement disproportionately impacts vulnerable populations. Ramsey said nothing. She continued. Maplewood has housed elderly residents exclusively for over 23 years. Several tenants meet the protected class criteria outlined in Geller. This building isn't just a home, it's a living archive of people the city has forgotten. Silence. Then Brewster snorted. Your Honor, this is theater. No court has ever halted a development project based on emotional storytelling and half-baked historical claims. Evelyn turned to him slowly, the faintest trace of steel entering her voice. The court will decide what's half-baked. The crack appears. Ramsey flipped through the pages in front of him again. For the first time since the hearing began, he looked directly at Evelyn. Not past her, not around her. At her, you seem remarkably familiar with preservation law, Ms. Mercer. It's a commonly overlooked area in housing disputes, she replied modestly. Ramsey considered her for a long moment. Then he tapped the table lightly. I want a 15-minute recess, Miss Mercer, Mr. Brewster, my chambers, now. Behind the door. The chamber door closed behind them with a quiet click. Inside, Judge Ramsey removed his glasses and leaned against his desk. Mr. Brewster, he began, were you aware of these cases Ms. Mercer is referencing? Brewster hesitated. We reviewed relevant law, Your Honor, but we considered Williams and Geller inapplicable to this jurisdiction. Ramsey's eyes narrowed. In what grounds? On the grounds that preservation status doesn't typically apply to residential buildings, especially those not formally registered. Evelyn remained quiet, letting Brewster dig. Ramsey turned to her. Ms. Mercer, where did you study law? Evelyn's answer was simple. Columbia, Your Honor, class of 2009. Ramsey blinked, then something settled behind his eyes. And your prior practice? I led housing and civil rights litigation in D.C. Most recently, I served as lead counsel on Mercer v. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Ramsey's breath caught. That case had reached the Supreme Court. It had changed everything about the federal oversight of housing vouchers. Her name was on every legal journal across the country. And now she stood in his courtroom, wearing a $30 sweater and shoes that had seen one too many winters. You're that Evelyn Mercer? He asked, not masking the disbelief. Yes, Your Honor. Ramsey leaned back slowly. I see. Brewster remained frozen. Ramsey straightened, folding his hands. Let's return to court. He didn't say another word as he opened the chamber door. But Evelyn didn't need him to. The shift had begun. The courtroom air had changed. It wasn't louder. It wasn't even warmer. But something in it now felt electric, as though everyone from the gallery to the jury box to the clerks at the edge of the room had become aware they'd missed something. And that something was Evelyn Mercer. When the chamber doors reopened, Judge Leonard Ramsey entered first, his gait deliberate. He didn't meet anyone's eyes, but his posture had changed, less dismissive, more reserved, as if a recalibration had quietly taken place. Behind him walked Brewster, whose usual self-assurance had dulled to a pale version of itself. Evelyn followed last, still the same gray sweater, still the same quiet presence. But this time, when she stepped forward, the room seemed to lean in. She hadn't changed, but now people were finally starting to see her, exposing the fault line. Judge Ramsey resumed his seat and tapped his pen twice before speaking. We'll return to the matter of the preservation eligibility. He said more slowly than before. Miss Mercer, I believe you were about to present further documentation. Yes, Your Honor. Evelyn lifted a folder from her tote. Not flashy, not pristine, but neat. She approached the bench and handed it to the clerk. These documents outline Maplewood's compliance with all 5 criteria established in Geller, via Boston Housing Authority for Emergency Preservation Classification. Ramsey flipped through the first few pages, his brow furrowed. And these were submitted previously. They were included in our third filing, dated April 4th. Brewster interjected a little too quickly. Your Honor, we didn't receive any preservation-related briefs in that batch. Evelyn turned to him, unflustered. Page 91, section 4-5, labeled Supplemental Considerations. It was accompanied by Exhibit 1. Ramsey gestured to his clerk. Pull up the April 4th submission. The clerk returned moments later with the file in question. He nodded once, confirming its presence. It's there, Your Honor. Ramsey peered at Brewster over his glasses. So, noted Mr. Brewster. A subtle but unmistakable blow. The courtroom was silent. Evelyn returned to her seat. A subtle transformation. Walter Fields leaned in from behind. Did you just win? Evelyn smiled faintly. I just earned his attention. Walter chuckled under his breath, the sound raspy but warm. That might be harder. Across the aisle, Brewster conferred with his team, voices low but urgent. They were now reacting, not leading. That mattered. Every powerful system resists being told. It's wrong, but they cannot ignore the mirror when it's held up the right way. Not aggressively, not arrogantly, just persistently. Evelyn had held that mirror up, and the cracks were starting to show. An unexpected question. Ramsey turned the page in the preservation brief. This clause, he said aloud, refers to a community covenant from 1972. Ms. Mercer, do you have documentation for this covenant? Yes, Your Honor. It's Addendum B to the original property deed registered with the Suffolk County Clerk. You have the deed. I do. She rose and handed the document to the clerk, who passed it forward. Ramsey examined it closely. This language, it clearly limits redevelopment for commercial purposes unless approved by a 2/3 resident majority. Has that approval been obtained? Evelyn looked directly at him. No, Your Honor. In fact, the residents were never informed. This redevelopment was even on the table until after Fairpoint submitted their application. Ramsey's jaw tightened. Brewster stood. Your Honor, the current leaseholders don't hold title. The covenant has no binding effect on subsequent owners without reaffirmation. That's incorrect, Evelyn said calmly. In Latimer v. Crescent Development, the Massachusetts Supreme Court held that such covenants remain enforceable if recorded with the original deed and not specifically revoked or overridden in a sale contract, which this one was not. Brewster blinked. Ramsey leaned forward. You're certain? Yes, Your Honor. The county office confirms the covenant was never modified. She placed a printout on the evidence table. I've included a certified letter from the county recorder, verifying that fact. Ramsey held the page for a moment longer than necessary. Then he nodded slowly. You've done your homework, Ms. Mercer. Not Miss Mercer. Please sit down. Not we'll move on. Just that, you've done your homework. A small sentence, but the entire courtroom heard it. And Evelyn Mercer had just landed her first real blow. Brewster backpedals. Your Honor, Brewster said quickly. Even if the covenant remains, it should not supersede the zoning changes approved by the City Council. We maintain that Fairpoint proceeded in good faith. Ramsey held up a hand. I understand your position, Mr. Brewster. Then to Evelyn, is there precedent for covenant enforcement after zoning approval? Yes, Evelyn replied. Klein v. Newton Development, 2011. The court found that zoning does not negate prior legal covenants if those covenants are still recorded and active. Ramsey stared at her. Page number. Page 33 of my supplemental brief. The judge turned to the clerk. Bring me the Klein file and the Geller case. It was a small storm now. Papers shuffling, clerks moving defense, counsel, flipping through binders. They suddenly realized weren't as thorough as they thought. Evelyn stood still in the middle of it. She had walked into this courtroom, looking like someone the system could dismiss. Now the system was orbiting her. Outside the frame, meanwhile the gallery had changed. Whispers now passed like sparks. Who is she? I thought she was a junior. No, she's leading. Did you see what she just did? Even one of the reporters previously disinterested was now scribbling fast. Cameras weren't allowed in this courtroom, but the story was beginning to write itself. Back at the bench, Ramsey tapped his pen. This court will take a short recess. Upon return, we will discuss the implications of the covenant and its standing under Klein and Latimer. As he stood to exit, he paused and looked at Evelyn. There was no condescension in his expression now, just consideration, and perhaps respect. A word from behind the scenes. As the room emptied for recess, Walter reached for Evelyn's hand. I never saw anyone make that man blink before he said. Evelyn smiled. It's not about making him blink. What is it about then? It's about showing him what he refused to see until now. Walter sat back slowly. Well, I think he sees you now. Evelyn looked toward the bench where Ramsey had just been seated. So do they all? 15 minutes. That was all the time the court granted for recess. But in those 15 minutes, something began to unfold outside the courtroom. Something Evelyn Mercer had planned for, just as carefully as her preservation briefs and case law citations. Because the real verdict was never going to be rendered in court alone. It would also be handed down by the public, by the whispers in the hallway, by the reporters stationed near the courthouse steps, by the elderly residents and their families, and the local media who hadn't thought this hearing would amount to much until now. And Evelyn knew how fast a courtroom moment could turn into a citywide conversation. Outside the marble walls, reporters once disengaged and scrolling through their phones were now fully alert. A lean woman with a press badge for the Boston Chronicle tapped her recorder as Evelyn emerged with Walter Fields at her side. Ms. Mercer, she called, voice sharp, can you confirm that Judge Ramsey is considering halting the redevelopment based on a 50-year-old covenant? Evelyn didn't break stride. What the court considers, she said, is based on evidence, not rumors. But is it true you invoked a preservation precedent that's never been used in this district before? Evelyn paused, finally facing the reporter. If that's true, she said calmly, then I suppose it's about time it was. The woman blinked, caught off guard by the quiet confidence. Do you believe the court was initially biased against your clients? Walter stepped forward, about to speak, but Evelyn gently touched his arm. I believe assumptions exist everywhere, she said, but they only win when they go unchallenged. Her voice was even, her tone was measured, but every syllable landed with surgical clarity. The reporter leaned in. Is it true that you're the same Evelyn Mercer from the Mercer v. HUD decision? No comment. She turned to help Dolores Meeks navigate the courthouse steps. The reporter stared after them. No comment, which was, of course, the most tantalizing answer of all. Back in session. When the court resumed, the atmosphere was denser charged. Not louder, just more alive. Ramsey entered with the kind of controlled composure that suggested something had shifted behind his eyes. He had read the cases Evelyn cited, and they hadn't been exaggerations or creative interpretations. They were solid, strategically timed, precisely placed. He sat, adjusted his glasses, and looked at Brewster. "Mr. Brewster, do you have any material objections to the applicability of Geller or Latimer in this context?" Brewster cleared his throat. His voice lacked the relaxed sheen it had earlier. "Only, Your Honor, that their circumstances differ substantially, particularly in terms of commercial valuation and urban planning precedent." Evelyn didn't wait to be invited. "With respect, Your Honor," she said, "rising those cases were built on structural fairness, not just circumstance." Ramsey turned to her proceed. The Geller ruling emphasized not just legal compliance, but ethical accountability. It recognized that city planning decisions often overlook the human cost of displacement, especially for seniors and veterans. She held up another document. "This is a petition signed by 47 current Maplewood residents opposing the redevelopment. We're submitting it not as legal proof, but as contextual relevance to demonstrate community opposition." Ramsey took the document and the legal component. She placed two more exhibits forward: the deed covenant and a statement from the original property trustee, archived and notarized, confirming that the intent of the covenant was precisely to prevent situations like this. Brewster stepped forward, straining to sound unthreatened. "Your Honor, even if these documents have merit the economic interests of the city." Ramsey held up a hand. "We'll get to that, Mr. Brewster." Then he turned to Evelyn. "You seem to have anticipated every argument." Evelyn met his gaze, only the ones people usually ignore. A beat of silence. Then Ramsey scribbled something in his notes. No objection. No dismissal. Just a gesture of recognition, however quiet. And the courtroom knew the tide was turning. A new kind of pressure. Outside the courtroom, social media had already caught wind of what was happening. A local Twitter account posted, "Who is Evelyn Mercer and how is she schooling Fairpoint Realty and a sitting judge at the same time?" An image circulated from earlier that morning. Evelyn guiding Dolores Meeks down the courthouse steps. Her face unreadable, her gray sweater slightly wrinkled, her expression composed. Someone captioned it, "Not all heroes wear suits." It was retweeted over 10,000 times by evening. And among the many quiet eyes scrolling those posts were city council members, planning officials, local advocates, and donors who had never paid attention to Maplewood until now. The perception was shifting. And perception, Evelyn knew, was power. The heart of the matter, back in court. Ramsey addressed the room. "The court acknowledges that the covenant presented is legally recorded and potentially enforceable. Furthermore, the citations from Geller, Williams, and Latimer provide a sufficient basis to continue preservation review." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Ramsey looked to Brewster. "Do you wish to dispute the authenticity of the covenant or the applicability of Geller?" Brewster hesitated. "At this time, Your Honor, we would request an extension to review." Denied. The word landed with a snap. "The burden of proof lies with the developers. You've had ample opportunity." Then to Evelyn. "Ms. Mercer, do you have further documentation for the court's review?" "Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to present Exhibit K, the original Maplewood Community Charter, drafted in 1972, which predates all known rezoning applications." She walked it to the bench herself. As she passed Brewster, his eyes followed her, not with ridicule this time, but with something closer to dread, because he knew what everyone now suspected. She wasn't going to stop. She was going to dismantle every argument one precedent at a time, and there was nothing theatrical about it. It was strategy, it was precision, and it was justice in motion. By the end of the day's session, the once solid walls around Fairpoint Realty's case had begun to crack. Not crumble, not collapse, but fracture slowly, visibly, undeniably. Each piece of evidence Evelyn Mercer introduced was like a tap with a hammer, calculated, deliberate, and aimed not at making noise, but revealing fault lines. Legal precedent, leaseholder rights, historical preservation. The covenant, the charter. One after another they stacked. Even those who'd once dismissed her now sat upright in their seats, watching the quiet woman in the gray sweater command the room without ever raising her voice. But Evelyn knew this wasn't enough. Not yet. To win, she needed more than cracks. She needed to break something open. And she was ready. A dangerous offer. The next morning, the court reconvened. Brewster's team looked less sharp, eyes heavier, ties looser. Ramsey took his seat and called the hearing to order. Before he could speak, Brewster stood. Your Honor, before we proceed, Fairpoint Realty would like to extend a proposal to the plaintiffs. Evelyn's gaze sharpened slightly. Ramsey raised a brow. On the record. Yes, Your Honor. He turned to Evelyn Counselor. She nodded. We're listening. Brewster cleared his throat. Fairpoint is prepared to offer a financial settlement to all remaining Maplewood residents, double the standard buyout amount, relocation assistance, and a 6-month grace period to vacate the premises. He gestured to a stack of printed agreements. We believe this is a generous solution and avoids further litigation delays. A ripple passed through the room, Generous calculated. Evelyn stepped forward. Your Honor, may I approach the bench? Ramsey nodded. She met Brewster halfway, lifting one of the printed agreements. She skimmed the first page, then the second, then held it up. There's no mention of continued lease protections for residents who refuse the buyout. Brewster shifted. Well, naturally, refusal would require vacating the property. Evelyn turned to Ramsey. Your Honor, this isn't a settlement. It's leverage, a veiled threat in the language of compromise. She lowered the papers. None of these documents contain legal waivers. No language referencing the deed covenant. Nothing protecting the residents' rights if they decline. Brewster stepped forward. Counselor, we're offering dignity, opportunity. Evelyn didn't raise her voice. Dignity doesn't come in the form of a check with a ticking clock attached. Her words struck deep because everyone knew she was right. The residents react. Behind her, the residents shifted uneasily. Dolores turned to Walter. 2 times the buyout, she whispered. That's more than I've ever had. Walter didn't blink, and it's not enough. Evelyn glanced back. She didn't speak to them. She didn't have to. She was showing them what they were worth by refusing to let that figure define their value. Ramsey tapped his pen. Mr. Brewster, you're free to offer settlements, but this court will not enforce buyout conditions as substitutes for covenant law. That was it. A line in the sand, and a signal that even the judge now understood what Evelyn had been fighting for. Breaking the silence, the gallery, once quiet, began to buzz. Word had traveled. There were now people seated along the back walls, city staffers, junior attorneys, and more than one member of the press. Every seat was filled. They weren't there for the spectacle. They were there for the moment, the one Evelyn had worked toward since the beginning. Brewster knew it. He could feel the tide turning. He rose again. Your Honor, in light of mounting delays, we respectfully request a temporary injunction against Ms. Mercer from introducing any further exhibits not previously submitted in pre-trial documentation. Evelyn was already ready. Your Honor, she said, Fairpoint has filed 6 separate amendments to their filings in the past 3 weeks, 3 of them in direct response to arguments we raised. She held up a list. My exhibits are in direct response to those additions. If they may evolve their case in real time, so may we? Ramsey paused, then nodded. Objection denied. Another fracture, and this time it echoed. The face behind the mask. That afternoon, Evelyn called her final witness, Mr. Edward Franklin, former Maplewood trustee and co-signatory of the 1972 covenant. He was 84 now, balding. Their hands shook slightly as he was sworn in, but his voice when it came was resolute. My partners and I created the Maplewood Covenant to protect working-class residents from being forced out. We knew what would happen. Once the land became valuable, we saw it coming. Brewster interjected. Mr. Franklin, do you have legal training? No, just a long memory and a good lawyer back in '72. Laughter rippled through the courtroom. Ramsey nodded. Proceed. Evelyn stepped forward. Did you ever intend for the covenant to expire? Never, Franklin said. We wrote it with permanence in mind. And were any of the current developers involved in negotiations during that time? No. Did any of them ever contact you for clarification? Franklin smiled wryly. Not once. Evelyn turned to the court. No further questions? As Franklin stepped down, he passed Evelyn and gripped her hand for a brief second. Thank you, he whispered, for seeing it through. The breaking point. Ramsey tapped his notes. He looked tired now, but not from frustration. From focus. This wasn't the easy case he'd anticipated. It was now a test of principle, of diligence, of legacy. And he was feeling it. Ms. Mercer, he said your presentation has been extensive. Is there anything further you wish to add before I make a preliminary decision? Evelyn stood. Only this, Your Honor. She walked to the center of the courtroom, something she hadn't done until now. This case is not just about zoning. It's not about economic viability. It's not about settlement packages with tight deadlines. Her eyes swept the room. It's about whether the law will protect those without a voice, whether a piece of paper signed 50 years ago with the full intent to defend the vulnerable still means something today. She paused. This courtroom doesn't just rule on buildings, it rules on values, on dignity, on whether a promise made by those long gone still carries weight. Then softly, "I believe it does." She returned to her seat. Silence. Then Ramsey exhaled, and the courtroom knew the breaking point had come. The moment Evelyn Mercer sat down, it was as if the entire courtroom exhaled with her, not because it was over, but because everyone knew they had just witnessed something rare. A closing not of theatrics, but of truth delivered with such quiet conviction that even those who disagreed were left without the words to challenge her. Judge Leonard Ramsey didn't speak right away. He simply stared at the thick stack of documents before him. Evelyn's briefs, the charter, the deed covenant case, law citations, sworn statements. The law was clear, but so was the magnitude of the decision he was now being asked to make. This wasn't just a ruling on property rights. It was a referendum on what justice meant in a city that had long made a habit of looking away. The court holds its breath. Ramsey removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "I have presided over hundreds of property disputes," he said. "Finally, zoning fights, development, rights, landlord-tenant conflicts. Most are forgettable." A pause. "This one is not." He turned to Evelyn. "Ms. Mercer, your presentation has raised serious questions about due process, about legal oversight, and about how this court weighs precedent against policy." Then he looked to Brewster. "And Mr. Brewster, while your client's position reflects valid economic concerns, I remind you, courts are not designed to secure profit. They are designed to secure rights." The room was still. "I will issue a formal decision on the injunction request within 72 hours, Ramsey concluded. "In the meantime, no eviction orders will be processed, no construction shall begin, and no additional negotiations shall proceed with residents without court supervision." It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a stay of execution. And to Evelyn and the 65 residents watching from behind her, that meant everything. Outside the courtroom, as the judge exited and the bailiff announced adjournment, the courtroom erupted into whispers. Reporters scrambled for quotes. Attorneys packed their files. But Evelyn didn't move. Not yet. She stayed seated, letting the weight of the moment sink in, not for her, but for the people whose lives had hung in the balance. Walter leaned over. "What happens next?" Evelyn looked toward the clerk gathering the documents, then toward the now empty bench where Ramsey had just sat. "Now," she said, "we wait. The waiting game." Over the next 2 days, the city of Boston buzzed with speculation. News outlets ran headlines like, "Unknown, attorney stalls," $80 million development deal in stunning court, play, judge pauses, eviction of elderly residents after covenant resurfaces. Who is Evelyn Mercer? Podcasts debated the ethics of last-minute legal tactics. City officials bristled over the project delays, but something was changing, something harder to quantify than policy or law. The public was paying attention, and not to the developers, to the residents, to Evelyn, to the simple truth that sometimes quiet defiance carries more force than 1,000 speeches. Back to her roots. On the second evening, Evelyn returned home, laid her small apartment, still lit by a single desk lamp and a wall lined with legal books. The gray sweater was folded over a chair. Her blazer from that morning was still hanging on the door. She stood at the mirror. For a long time, she said nothing. Then finally, she whispered, "You did what you came to do." It wasn't pride, it was purpose. A phone call that meant more. That night, her phone buzzed, unknown number. She picked up, "Ms. Mercer?" "Yes, this is Jennifer Klein. I'm one of the trustees for the Historic Preservation Council. I've been following the case." Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly, "I see. I just wanted to say if you win this injunction and Maplewood is granted preservation status, you'll have changed how the city handles community protection forever. That's not why I did it. I know that's why it's working." Evelyn said nothing for a moment. Then, "Thank you." They hung up. The letter. The next morning, a manila envelope was slid under her door. No return address. Inside was a folded piece of paper, handwritten. "Dear Ms. Mercer, when I moved into Maplewood in 1981, I had just lost my husband. I didn't think anyone would ever fight for me again. You didn't just defend our homes, you reminded us that we still matter. That's Dolores Meeks." Evelyn folded the letter with care. She didn't cry. but her hands trembled slightly as she placed it in the top drawer of her desk. Day 3. The courthouse was quieter this time, but the gallery was full. Everyone knew what was coming. Judge Ramsey entered at 9:01 a.m. robes, sharp face, unreadable. He took his seat and opened a manila folder. The court has reached a decision regarding the plaintiff's request for a preliminary injunction. The air snapped tight. Ramsey continued. The court finds sufficient legal basis for enforcing the 1972 covenant restricting redevelopment and further recognizes the historical significance of the Maplewood community under the standards outlined in Geller v. Boston Housing Authority and Latimer v. Crescent Development. A murmur, half gasp, half prayer. Therefore, this court issues a preliminary injunction effective immediately. All redevelopment efforts by Fairpoint Realty are to cease pending further review. Eviction orders are suspended indefinitely. Walter exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for years. Evelyn simply closed her eyes. Ramsey wasn't done. Additionally, the court recommends that the matter be submitted to the state's Historic Protection Board for emergency preservation consideration. Now even Brewster's associates flinched, because this wasn't just a temporary pause. It was a roadmap for permanent protection. Ramsey's final words. Ramsey looked at Evelyn. Ms. Mercer, your advocacy was thorough, impressive. He paused, and instructive. Then to Brewster, let this serve as a reminder. Legal precedent may age, but it does not expire. Brewster nodded, defeated. Ramsey stood. Court is adjourned. Gavel struck, and with it, the weight of the entire system shifted just a little. But enough. Victory, as Evelyn Mercer knew, doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it comes with silence, the kind of silence that comes after thunder, the kind that lingers, echoes. When Judge Ramsey adjourned the court with a ruling that stunned even seasoned legal watchers, the silence afterward wasn't because no one had anything to say. It was because no one had expected someone like Evelyn Mercer, quiet, plain-dressed, and unknown, to be the one who shifted the tide. But now the tide was moving, and it was sweeping through more than just the halls of court. Shockwaves. Through the system. By noon that day, the injunction against Fairpoint Realty had made local and national headlines. Court freezes, $80 million development after invisible. Lawyer invokes 50-year-old covenant, Boston Ledger. Simple sweater. Complex law. Who is Evelyn Mercer? The Atlantic Weekly. The woman who stopped the bulldozers, NPR. But inside Fairpoint's executive offices, the news landed like a seismic tremor. Calls were made, boards assembled, damage control strategies drafted. And when Evelyn's photo, mid-sentence eyes, intent, lips just parted as she argued, precedent hit the front page of the Globe, it wasn't the gray sweater they noticed. It was the fire in her stillness, and the fact that someone had stopped them without ever raising their voice. Behind the cameras. That afternoon, Evelyn stood in front of the courthouse steps again. This time, she wasn't anonymous. Reporters flooded toward her, microphones thrusted cameras clicking like insects in a storm. One young journalist from Channel 4 leaned in. Ms. Mercer, was it your strategy from the beginning to present yourself in such an understated way? Evelyn blinked. I presented myself as I am, but many believe you deliberately downplayed your credentials to challenge the court's bias. A long pause. Then she answered, if someone assumes I'm incapable because of how I look or dress, that's not a reflection of me. A reporter from a national station jumped in. Do you consider this a win against corporate abuse? Evelyn thought for a moment. This isn't about winning. This is about remembering who the law is supposed to protect. She turned away after that, gently guiding Dolores Meeks down the final step. Dolores whispered, you could have let them have the spotlight. Evelyn smiled faintly. They already had it. Today was about taking it back. The boardroom crumbles. Inside Fairpoint Realty, the fallout had begun. Brewster stood before a tense conference table. Executives flanked by legal counsel flipped through binders with trembling fingers. The Covenant One VP asked, you didn't know about it. Brewster cleared his throat. It was buried. Obscure. We never anticipated a challenge. This coordinated. The CFO tossed the Boston Globe across the table. I'll tell you what's coordinated. Our investors walking out the door. Silence. Then a decision to delay the next project, cancel public-facing interviews, and above all, avoid Evelyn Mercer. Because the name they'd never cared to learn before was now the one they feared. Gloria's letter. That evening, Evelyn returned to her small apartment, tired but alert. She didn't take off her coat, didn't set down her briefcase. Instead, she opened the mailbox outside her building. Inside was a white envelope, thick and hand-addressed. She recognized the handwriting instantly. Gloria. She read it in the quiet hallway, back pressed against the mailroom wall. Dear Evelyn, I was 17 the first time someone told me I was just a woman and wouldn't understand legal matters. It happened again when I was 30, again at 50, and again at 78, when Fairpoint sent me a letter with no return address. You didn't just argue for our right to stay. You reminded me that maybe the law hasn't forgotten us entirely. No matter what happens next, you gave us something that money can't buy. Dignity. And that matters more than property lines. Yours, Gloria Meeks. Evelyn folded the letter with care, pressed it to her chest, then continued up the stairs in silence. A quiet celebration. That night, the Maplewood residents held a potluck in the community center basement. Paper plates, lemonade, old chairs. But laughter danced between the tables like light on water. Walter lifted a glass. To Evelyn Mercer, he said, voice shaking. She didn't just save our homes. She made the people trying to erase us remember our names. Everyone clapped. Evelyn raised her cup in return. This isn't the end, she said. It's just the first time the world had to listen. A beat. Then she added, let's make sure they keep listening. The flame ignites. In the days that followed, Evelyn received invitations from legal podcasts, university panels, and city justice committees. Some she accepted, most she didn't, because she hadn't done this to build a brand. She'd done it to build a wall between what was right and what was easy, to build a flame that others could carry when she was no longer in the room. At one small civil rights lecture she did attend, a first-year law student nervously raised her hand. Ms. Mercer, what advice would you give to someone who doesn't look the part, who walks into a courtroom and gets dismissed before saying a word? Evelyn smiled gently. Let them underestimate you. A pause, then make sure they never do it again. Mornings had always been Evelyn Mercer's quietest hours, but now even the quiet had changed. She stood before her mirror, the same one she had faced the morning of the hearing, when she'd tied her hair back, removed her pearl earrings, and slid into that plain gray sweater with a deliberate whisper. This has to work. Now the woman staring back looked older. Not aged, but worn by impact. Like stone shaped by wind, like steel that had held. Her reflection was no longer part of the strategy. It was part of the story. A call from the bench. That same morning, Evelyn's phone rang. The caller ID was unfamiliar, but the voice on the other end wasn't. Miss Mercer, this is Judge Leonard Ramsey. Evelyn straightened. Your Honor, I wanted to call personally and inform you. He said that the Historic Preservation Board has officially opened a full review into the Maplewood property. The court has appointed a special master to oversee resident protections in the interim. Evelyn closed her eyes for a beat. Thank you. I should be thanking you, Ramsey replied, his tone less formal. I reviewed your original filings last night. You referenced 13 cases I hadn't thought about in years. He paused. You made me think again, counselor. Evelyn let the silence fill the line. May I ask, Ramsey continued, why you didn't simply present your credentials from the start? She smiled faintly. Because, Your Honor, if I had, you might have listened to the resume instead of the residence. Another pause. Then, point taken. Click, a new kind of weight. The public recognition had grown. Not loud, not fame, but presence. Her inbox was now filled with messages from housing advocates, public interest firms, and former law students who'd left the courtroom years ago, tired and invisible. One message stood out, from an older attorney. You reminded me why I joined the bar in the first place. I'd forgotten. Thank you for reminding me. But even good change comes with weight. Evelyn received word that Fairpoint had filed a motion for appeal not unexpected, but designed to stall, drain, and pressure. She knew their tactics: delay, inflate, discourage. But she also knew something else. Now they were stalling because they were losing. Back at Maplewood. The halls of Maplewood felt lighter now. Residents passed her with warm nods. Some left small gifts outside her door. A potted plant, a hand-knitted coaster, an old but beautiful photograph of the neighborhood from the 1970s. Thought you should see what you saved, the note read. In the common area, she sat beside Gloria Meeks, whose presence had quietly become a symbol in its own right. They're going to come after you again, aren't they? Gloria asked gently. Evelyn nodded. They already have. You still ready? Evelyn looked toward the dusty community bulletin board, where a flyer now hung, "Historic Review, Underway Residents, encouraged to submit testimony." She stood, adjusted her collar, and said, "I didn't walk into that courtroom for a win. I walked in to make sure they couldn't ignore us again." Gloria smiled, "And you did." The mirror revisited. That evening, Evelyn returned to the mirror. This time she didn't wear the gray sweater. She wore black slacks, a blue blouse, hair down. No pearl earrings, just quiet readiness. She leaned closer to the mirror. "You're not the story," she whispered to herself, "but you were the start." Then she turned off the light and walked away. The mantle passes. The following week, Evelyn spoke at a legal roundtable hosted at the Suffolk Law Center. The topic: bias in the courtroom, strategy or identity. A young woman in the front row asked a pointed question. "Don't you think what you did was manipulative dressing down, letting the judge assume?" Evelyn smiled, not dismissively, but with understanding. "I didn't manipulate anyone," she said. "I let the system reveal itself." Then she looked at the student squarely. "And sometimes, to change the rules, you have to first let the rules play out exactly as expected." Another student raised her hand. "Do you think what you did will make a difference for others?" Evelyn considered it. "I think I carried the weight long enough for someone else to walk in without it." The final letter. Later that week, Evelyn received a small envelope without a stamp, hand-delivered. Inside, a short message in blue ink. "You made me see myself more clearly, and the bench I've sat on for 20 years more honestly. Leonard Ramsey." She smiled, folded it, placed it next to Gloria's letter in the drawer. Justice doesn't always leave behind headlines. It doesn't always echo in gavel, strikes, or courtroom applause. Sometimes it lingers like breath on glass, fading slowly, quietly, but altering everything it touches. For Evelyn Mercer, the case of Maplewood hadn't ended with a ruling. It had only begun a shift, not just for a courtroom, not just for 65 elderly residents, but for a city that had stopped seeing people who no longer shouted, and for a woman who had once been underestimated in every room she walked into. The final review. 2 months later, the State Historic Preservation Board convened to finalize the status of the Maplewood property. Evelyn didn't speak that day. She didn't need to. Her filings had already spoken volumes, a curated history of the community resident testimonies and aerial photos showing how, even as skyscrapers rose around it, Maplewood remained one of the last untouched pockets of generational dignity. The board voted 6-1 in favor of full historical designation, which meant no redevelopment, no forced displacement, no demolition, only restoration, preservation, respect. Ramsey's change back at the courthouse. Judge Leonard Ramsey began making quiet reforms. He ordered implicit bias training for clerks, requested blind review protocols for first-time counsel, and he stopped assuming that polished shoes or tailored suits told the whole story. One morning, he addressed a group of new attorneys. "In this room, never mistake appearance for aptitude, because I almost did." He never said Evelyn's name. He didn't have to. They all knew. Dolores and the Rose Garden. Spring came early that year. In the courtyard of Maplewood, residents planted roses in fresh soil. Dolores Meeks bent carefully to press a bloom into the earth. "That one's for Evelyn," she said. "Why the white one?" asked her neighbor. "Because it doesn't need to scream to be seen." The clerk's observation. A young court clerk who had watched Evelyn's trial from the gallery approached her months later. "I'm applying to law school," she said shyly. "Because of me?" Evelyn asked, surprised. "Because of how you made the law feel," the girl replied. "Like it wasn't just a weapon, but a shield." Evelyn nodded slowly. "Then make sure you use it for both." The box in her closet. One evening, Evelyn pulled a small box from her closet. Inside were her original legal briefs, a folded copy of the 1972 Covenant, Gloria's handwritten letter, Ramsey's blue ink note, and a photo black and white of the original Maplewood trustees breaking ground. She added one last item, a news clipping with the headline, "The Woman Who Wore Gray and Stopped the City." She folded the box closed, labeled it Legacy, Not Trophy, then returned it to the back of the closet smiling, because she didn't need to display it. She lived it, a letter to the next one. On her way out the door for another case, this one quieter, less publicized, Evelyn left a note on her desk, to no one in particular, or maybe to someone not yet ready. "If they dismiss you, let them look past you, talk over you, underestimate you. Then do the work so thoroughly that they never forget your name. Let them think you're small, then remind them how the smallest hinge swings the biggest door. And when they ask who taught you to fight like that, tell them Justice did. She slipped the note into her case file and walked into the next courtroom. Final frame. The sun poured through the courthouse windows, casting gold across the polished floors. Evelyn Mercer stepped forward, briefcase in hand. No pearls, no gray sweater, just presence. Behind her, the world still argued, still forgot, still judged on sight. But ahead of her, another courtroom waited. Another name, another battle, another assumption ready to break. And Evelyn, she would be ready, not to be seen, but to make others seen. Because some victories don't wear medals, they wear memory.